wealth can be created or destroyed, much easier to destroy than it is to create, and competition is the most powerful force we know to actually create it. And from that sort of flows pretty much everything.
Well, welcome everyone to the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome back to those who've been here with us previously. My name is Matthew Lesh and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the IEA. Unfortunately, Mark Littlewood can't be here tonight, so you've got a slightly different ML, but hopefully I can successfully manage to have a good discussion about this excellent and I think quite important book in these times. Before we turn to our panelists, just a few little pieces of housekeeping. So this evening we're going to have about a half an hour discussion in conversation going through some of the main highlights of the book and how it kind of relates to some recent policy discussions. And then there'll be an opportunity after that for questions from the audience. We are recording this, so if you put up your hand to ask a question, you will be filmed for the IEA's YouTube channel. Of course, I'd kindly ask all people present to turn off their mobile phones. I'd also just inform you that the gentleman's restroom is outside, left through the courtyard and back around, while the ladies' lavatories are downstairs in this building. So I now have the opportunity to welcome tonight's two excellent guest speakers. The first one is Shanker Singham, who's one of the world's leading international trade and competition lawyer experts. He's a CEO of Competere and a former cleared advisor to the United States Trade Representative, as well as the Secretary of State for International Trade in the UK. And of course, Shanker is also an IEA Fellow and former Director of the International Trade and Competition Unit. I'm also very excited to welcome Alden Abbott. He's a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Institute, focusing on antitrust issues. Before joining Mercatus, Alden served in the Federal Trade Commission's General Counsel from 2018 to 2021, and he represented the Commission in court and provided legal advice to its representatives. Welcome this evening. So, as you know, we're here today to have a discussion about their new book, which is called Trade, Competition and Domestic Regulatory Policy, Trade Liberalisation, Competitive Markets and Property Rights Protections. Now, of course, it's a thick book. You could arguably say it's a quite technical book, but I think it really touches on some of the kind of essential issues of our time when it comes to economic policy and tries to address what are some of the barriers to our prosperity when it comes to regulatory, trade and competition issues. So I thought I'd kind of start off with a very kind of open general thought, which is why did you want to write this book?
So I think I wrote an earlier book in 2007 on similar themes of trade and competition and market distortions. And the theory that we developed of market distortions had advanced in the last since 2007. So I guess every 15 years we have to come back to the subject and write again. But I think partly I wrote the book because when I wrote the book in 2007, I assumed that would be the end of the story, and we will have successfully convinced policymakers and governments that trade liberalisation, competition, property rights protection, all these things should be firmly embedded in government policy, and we will have won that argument. And obviously, since 2007, far from winning the argument, I think we are comprehensively on the defensive on those things. So I think what we wanted to do was to re-express or rediscover for people the sort of some fundamental principles, and then see how those fundamental principles have played through in the global economy. So things like wealth can be created or destroyed, much easier to destroy than it is to create, and competition is the most powerful force we know to actually create it. And from that sort of flows pretty much everything. And we think of property rights, competition and trade as sort of an inverted triangle, if you will, with property rights on the base, because everything comes ultimately from property rights. And property is what firms compete with. And competition, trade and competition are really just, they're just forms of competition. One is across borders, the other is, domestically, typically. And so those are the sort of key pillars that we wanted to express. Now, Alden and I have worked on for a couple of decades the theory of anti-competitive market distortions, and that is essentially deviations from these things. So the more you deviate from these things, the worse it gets. So, and I guess the final thing I'd say on it is I think we've failed to express the quantum of distortions. So what is the actual gap, if you will, between your potential GDP per capita if you have an undistorted market, if you protect property rights and you have competition as we define it, which I think we'll come to, but and liberalisation. That gap between what your GDP per capita is now and what it could be is much, much bigger than people think it is. So I think a lot of people think that you take down the tariffs at the border and the rest of it is a sort of bonus. It's icing on the cake. And we're kind of, based on the work we've done and the empirical work we've done and the econometric work we've done, we are of the view that it is the whole cake. It's actually significantly bigger than trade liberalisation at the border, only. And so that's really the reason we wanted to sort of express all this and try to win the narrative again.
I mean, so Alden, coming to you, I think this fascinating story about the connection, because I think often in economics these issues are studied very separately. There are trade economists and there's subjects in trade, there's subjects in competition, and then there's also completely separate field when it comes to domestic regulation. I was wondering if you wanted to give us some thoughts on how you think these things all come together. Like, what is the purpose of what you're trying to achieve here for consumers?
Right. Well, it's trying to reflect the fact that's been understood actually by political economists since Adam Smith and certainly David Ricardo, that properly understood international trade is aimed at increasing welfare, by specialization, by comparative advantage, not just to traders, but individuals, consumers throughout an economy benefit. And in theory, as we explain in our book, competition law, properly understood, also is aimed at attacking anti-competitive agreements among firms that harmed consumers, that prevented all the benefits from a free market from being realized. So properly understood, these things are complementary. Traditionally, competition law in most countries is developed as a form of domestic law focused on domestic firms. But a lot of competitive harm is done, even if inadvertently or not, by government interventions that prevent markets from being as free as they could. International trade, one thinks, as Shanker mentioned, goods crossing the border, but particularly now in the internet economy, digital economy, there are electronic flows and value chains internationally. So goods and services and electrons flow across the border, but not always as seamlessly as they should because of restrictions imposed. Many of them are rules and regulations, even policies imposed by government. Why is that? Well, often it's the fact that certain interests, often firms, have lobbied for those sorts of restrictions. Now, these are restrictions that are not obviously against competition law, because that generally is applied to private behavior. In theory, it applies to certain public behavior. Certainly Europeans recognize that, and Americans do, but not as much as it should be. International trade law, it's good to get rid of tariffs, but if tariffs and quotas are replaced by new restrictions behind the border, trade is not going to realize its potential and the potential comparative advantage to bring about benefits to consumers around the world. So again, our theory is that consumer welfare is the underlying theory that animates, properly understood, both trade and competition law. And indeed, Adam Smith, going back to Adam Smith, said that really the value of competition, the benefit of competition was not to enrich the trader, it was for the ultimate consumer.
It's not about lots of small companies. Now, this is where you will get divergence from rooms in Westminster, including in this government. There will be many people who will say that actually small businesses are promotion of small business interests, fragmented markets, etc., is a goal of competition policy. We said this in the US in the 1950s. We applied this kind of vision to competition in the US in the 1950s. And the culmination of this was the terrible, terrible decision in the case called Vaughn's Grocery, where a merger was basically blocked on the basis that I think it was less than even 10% market share that combined parties would have. And basically in the 60s, economists realised that we have no theory that says that a small fragmented market is an intrinsic good. There is no justification.
So this is a distinction between, I guess, what I was maybe taught in Economics 101, which is the perfect model of competition is lots and lots of different firms, each competing with each other, doing exactly the same product. And that's not in practice how competition ever works.
That might be the case, depending on the sector, depending on the goods. That might be the productive and allocative efficiency maximised outcome. It might look like that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it really depends on the sector. And we really get into this point in the area of digital,
Indeed,
where I think this is the area where we probably give the lowest mark to the UK's regulatory reform package, because I think we write a lot about this in the book.
Yes.
These are sectors, tech and digital are sectors where you have a marginal cost curve declining to zero. It's very unusual. It's not like making widgets. Your U-shaped marginal cost curve is, I make these things that I need in a factory and so on, but it's not like that. So these firms are going to have to do lots of things that might look to somebody like they are violations of competition law in order to rapidly build an installed base, because they don't have durability of market power. We all remember MySpace. No, nobody remembers MySpace. Okay, so there's a reason why none of you younger people remember or even know anything about MySpace, because these issues or these industries are characterized by very different economics. And you have to factor that into consideration.
Yeah, I think in the case of the tech companies, there's some quite interesting analysis suggesting that they partake in what some people call dynamic competition. So they're competing across lots of different verticals viciously amongst each other, rather than being necessarily monopolists. I better though stop you there and go to questions to the audience, because we don't have too much more time left. Put up your hand, and we'll be here at the front, first one I call. So hold on, just wait a second for the microphone.
Sorry, Richard Glassball. Just a question about the Inflation Reduction Act in America. How do you view that from a competition point of view? Is it covered in the book, or is it a bit too recent for you to comment?
Just because we're limited on time and I saw loads of questions, why don't we take a few at the same time? Yes, gentleman there.
Hello, thank you. Felix, former IEA. I was going to ask, I think Alden mentioned tariffication of anti-competitive market distortions. Is this the answer? And if we were to try something like this, how do you prevent that from stopping us making gains from, say, how do we stop us from using that to, say, block, whether it's subsidised farmers or fisheries in developing countries? Should we be tariffing some of these anti-competitive market distortions?
Why don't we take one more, although those are quite meaty, very good questions. There's someone at the back.
Sorry, so just in terms of Brexit and investment, obviously you see a great chance for less regulation to increase our investment. But what do you think we need to do? Because since Brexit, investment has decreased. How do you think we need to convince these companies with less regulation as to come back into our country?
Do you, as our American friend, want to take the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yes, laws are given particular names by their promoters in order to make them sound good. The administration came up with this.
Yeah.
But basically, it justified a lot of additional spending and was supposedly, aimed at infrastructure, but also involved labor. A huge amount of spending. In fact, I think number of economists I respect have said it should have been called the Inflation Promotion Act, because it really was a huge amount of additional spending. Attached to that, the government has talked about price controls on pharmaceuticals, other areas. There's a history, price controls that shows they always fail when they're tried. So again, it was just a clever name given, I think, because at the time politically the Biden administration was hearing complaints about high inflation. Oh, well, we're going to do something about that. We're going to pass this act, which we call the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that's all there was to it. It was just really a political slogan, in my view.
Let me answer the tariff.
And maybe Brexit as well. Yeah.
So picking up the general tariff question, which includes the IRA, of course, as well. I think, obviously, putting tariffs on your trading partners is generally not a good thing, and is not generally not a pro-liberalisation measure. I want to be quite clear though about our proposals on tariffication of distortions, though, because first of all, not everything that is market distortive is anti-competitive. And if you consider and remember our definition of competition, there has to be on the particular rule or regulation, whatever it is that you're concerned about, there has to be an anti-competitive effect in a relevant product and geographic market. So there has to be that process. So this is not going to be something that is like the anti-dumping laws or even the countervailing duty laws. But it is tied to the level of the distortion, and it is connected to and allows the defendant to prove that they've eliminated the distortion. If in fact they have eliminated the distortion, then the tariff will therefore come down. But I think that there's a political reality here and there's an economic reality here. So when a country distorts its market for trade advantage through anti-competitive regulation, they are damaging global welfare. And in fact, if they're not damaging global welfare, then it's not an anti-competitive distortion by definition. So they're damaging global welfare. And do we care in the UK that global welfare is damaged? I would submit that we should. And therefore, if your goal is to maximise global welfare, increase GDP per capita across the whole globe, and then take the benefits as you can based on your own, activities and your own ingenuity and your own competitive process, then you've got a better shout if you're not doing things or you're not allowing countries around the world to damage global welfare in that way. The political reality is if you do nothing about distortions, and China is the poster child for this, but there are plenty of ACMDs all over the world, including in our own markets. If you do nothing about them, then you create people who have, I could be a steel company in Port Talbot or in Ohio or in Pennsylvania. I've closed down because of global competition, because of unfair competition. What does unfair competition mean? Well, in some cases, I may simply have closed down because I'm inefficient and I've failed to compete properly around the world. And that's just tough. But there are other cases where the failure is because of distortions in the other market that in order for that to be in effect, they have to be quite serious distortions and they have to be quite anti-competitive distortions, and I would submit the global steel distortions in China qualify for that. If you do nothing about that, you're opening the door for the kind of protectionism that we are now seeing in the US, in Europe, and around the world. And so I think you have to politically come up with a response to that problem. And what we did with our ACMD tariffication approach was to come up with a response. And it isn't just about tariffs and goods. You need to also deal with the issue in services and licenses, and you need to deal with the issue in government procurement. I remember, in the 90s, I represented a company that people also probably don't even remember, Alcatel-Lucent, which did telecom equipment. And we would go around the world bidding on telecom equipment, and there's an unknown company called Huawei would come in at about 1/3 of the cost, having stolen our intellectual property in PRA silos. And so, these companies...
There's a good book on this called Wireless Wars.
Yes, yeah. Well, so they went out of business, right? And you can't... Are we net better off because that happened? And Huawei has become the dominant telecom equipment provider? I would submit not. Not just for economic
Do you want to just say
reasons.
something quickly on Brexit before we go back to
Yeah,
small topic?
I think lower the regulatory barriers, lower the distortions, that will lower the cost of doing business in the UK, that will make your investment climate more attractive to people. There are many, many areas where you can do that. Some of it is European rules that we can change. A lot of it, frankly, is our own homegrown, rules that need
And
to be
we
changed.
could fix our anti-competitive planning system.
But well, particularly energy. I would single out energy as a good example of our own homegrown, disastrous approach. UK inflation rate 10%, whatever it was when the last set of figures came out. Most of that, if you look at energy inflation, energy cost, energy inflation is about 40%. In certain continental European countries who have similar inflation rates, the energy cost component is closer to 8 or 9%. So we have a very specific problem in the UK about, which is basically energy cost. Why? Yes, there's lots of environmental taxes and all these other things, but fundamentally, we've got locked in place a very high carbon floor price through the Climate Change Act in 2008, and we've got a very, very anti-competitive interconnection policy with respect to grid connections. So grid connect, it's almost like Stalinist Russia. I mean, if you have a grid connection, you are golden because they're so rare. And if Matthew produces 2 megawatts of electricity and I produce 20 megawatts, but I've applied first, he has to wait for 15 years for his grid. This is nonsense. This is all homegrown. This is all we've done it to ourselves, and we can change all this. And I would
Shall we get to some more questions? Dan, Phil, then the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. I apologise for being late. I was voting appropriately enough on the retained EU law legislation, which we've just done. And so forgive me, don't bother to answer this if I missed it before. But the Microsoft Activision merger, who's right, Brussels or London?
Oh, good question. Hold on, Philip.
Okay.
Thanks. I was reading a report a few weeks ago published by the aid agency CAFOD, and it was all dressed up in very anti-business and anti-free market rhetoric. And then when I read the actual report, it seemed it could have been written by the Institute of Economic Affairs. And what it was actually complaining about was the World Bank encouraging less developed countries to subsidise the creation of large agribusiness sort of farms, but perhaps more importantly, regulate seeds and regulate the registration of seeds in such a way that there were economies of scale in dealing with this regulation, and it was very difficult for small farms, seed sharing co-ops and so on to deal with the regulation. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that sort of policy from the World Bank, if that's too specific, more generally, the World Bank and its relationship with developing countries.
And just the gentleman at the back.
Hey, yes. Very nice to see you guys, Shanker, Matthew. Rod Richardson from Grace Richardson Fund in the U.S. Visiting today. You've argued, it seems, as I can tell from the talk so far and from your table of contents, for free trade based on the economic benefit to the consumer. But a very persuasive argument as well is the environmental benefit to the consumer and the world itself. So it seems to me that there's perhaps a missing chapter or maybe a missing book here on trade, competition, climate, and the environment. And I'm wondering if you have thought about how incredibly environmentally beneficial the kind of deep free trade that you're talking about here that goes into competition, particularly in power markets. Where some are very crony dominated and some others are open, and looking at the environmental benefits of trade and comparing that to what are sometimes argued to be environmental trade provisions like the carbon border adjustment mechanism or some of the environmental provisions that could put in trade agreements.
We're just slightly running out of time. So, Alden, do you want to come in first on the Microsoft question? That seems right up your alley.
Brussels was right. And I've written a little bit about this. I mean, basically, what Microsoft was doing was acquiring a certain number of games that would allow it to compete more effectively with Sony, and actually would have more direct competition among major gaming platforms that currently exist. And there's a lot of evidence brought forth, I think, by the parties how this would happen. The UK supposedly was concerned about some market which hasn't developed yet, that in the cloud, you would have cloud competition might be restrained because there's too much of the cloud services, or Microsoft is too high a share, would limit competition. Consumers trying to get into cloud gaming without consoles would have a harder time. First of all, that area hasn't developed. Second of all, a number of assurances and contractual agreements to make games available have been put forth by Microsoft. So to me, this made very, very little sense. You have a real more dynamic competition near term and some theoretical potential harm in an unrealized future market, which really hasn't yet developed. To me, that makes absolutely no sense.
So you heard it first here at the IEA. Brussels was right and London was wrong.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to come in on maybe Philip's World Bank and
the
the environment question?
Yeah. So, I mean, just to finish that, I think there are serious concerns about the direction of travel of the UK CMA on digital markets. I think they don't understand how digital markets actually can work. And the risk is they are going to do things, they're going to take actions that actually no other agency, serious big agency for a big country, are going to take, that will severely limit competition, actually limit competition, where the CMA's activity is anti-competitive as opposed to pro-competitive. A good example of this is you look at Google Bard, the AI from Google, which right now is available everywhere in the world except for the EU. It's not available in the EU because Google has taken the position that EU regulation is too restrictive. Well, I think Google will probably be looking carefully at what the UK is doing on its digital markets strategy and determining whether, in fact, the UK also should not. So we're going to lose access to a lot of these things. On your point, Philip, about CAFOD, I think, I mean, clearly, it's a similar point actually, which is how do you suggest policy that is going to be pro-new entrant, pro-consumer, pro-businesses of the future, all of those things. When you subsidise farms, when you create regulations that promote the interests of a large incumbent business, which is effectively what they're creating in Africa, the World Bank is creating these large incumbents, ostensibly to compete with other large incumbents in other African countries. You are damaging the ability of those new entrants to succeed. So I would agree with CAFOD on their criticism there. Rod, you'll be pleased to know that there is some attention paid in the book to environmental issues, and we particularly talk about CBAM. And we particularly talk about approaches. First of all, let me say at the outset, obviously nothing has done more to promote environmental good than progressive trade liberalisation and the economic gains and the efficiency gains that come from it. Nothing. Our approach to our approach on climate change, I think, needs to be through, and I would say the same thing about many areas of standards. International standards, and if a country is diverging from an agreed international standard for trade advantage, then we get into the market distortion kind of space. And a CBAM tariff based on that would, I think, be much more appropriate than the CBAM itself, which is, I think, well, first of all, aside from the fact that I think it's WTO violative, and I suspect India will win its case that it was about to bring on the European CBAM. The CBAM is also going to have a very detrimental effect on developing countries. Whereas, an approach that's based on actual effect on competition in the market is better because, if I'm a small developing country, and I'm doing something that is arguably harmful, it doesn't really have a market impact. It's not going to have an anti-competitive effect in a relevant product or geographic market, and so you wouldn't tarify that. Whereas if China is doing it, or a very large market is doing it, that's a whole different story.
And of course, I think there's also a very positive story to tell in terms of trade in clean goods, innovation in that space that then leads to much better environmental outcomes. If you can have more efficient trade, you have more environmentally friendly trade. But I'll leave it there in my final thoughts and closing remarks, since I think we've unfortunately run to time. I thank you very much, everyone, in particular our IEA Book Club members, our IEA donors who keep the lights on and keep us humble IEA staff employed. For those who are in the audience who are not IEA Book Club members, we do encourage you to join the book club. You can speak to Delino, who's at the back of the room. He's just put up his hand if you'd be interested in joining. From this point, this will be the end of our formal proceedings, but our guests have kindly agreed to stick around and sign any books that you might wish to purchase. We'll continue drinks in the room until 7:30 p.m. So please do help yourself to more refreshments, and thank you very much, especially more than anything else, to our two excellent guests for tonight's IEA Book Club.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.